Welcome to another episode of the Christian Combatives Podcast. Today we're hosted once again by our friends over at Christcore, the Christian Discord server. To give them a visit, go to discord.gg/Christian, discord.gg/Christian. In this episode, we discuss the use and prevalence of violence, sex, and politics in movies. We discuss the relationship between Christians and the government in regards to marriage, education, and even teaching Christianity in schools. Later on, Sola talks about the church fathers calling women inferior and how that idea may be misunderstood. This episode was actually a continuation of the conversation in the last episode. The recording here begins as Sola Ecclesia and Stigma are discussing the mature themes in movies. Sola points out that one of the few movies without overt sexuality in the past few years was actually the R-rated film Joker. So, let's jump right into that conversation.
I can't remember who said it, but he said everything when it comes to, violence, sex, or any of that stuff, it all has to be in service of the story, and it has to make sense, and it has to be done with a level of tact and a level of, what should I say, a moral backbone, basically. Like, it can't just be gratuitous there for the fun of it.
And, Joker, it doesn't have any sexuality in it, which is like somehow unusual for a modern comic book movie.
Yeah,
there's nothing sexual in it.
I was thinking about it. I was trying to think of a counterexample in Joker, but I can't come up with one. I mean, the guy is definitely a strange character, but yeah, it's not. That's not a realm that it really steps into.
Like, there's this scene where you can't see anything, but he gives his mother a bath. Mm-hmm. You can't see anything. He has a girlfriend, but in his head, that is. But they're just, it's like nothing happens. They're just sort of companions, and that's it. Like, it never does anything sexual, which is unusual for a modern comic book movie.
Well, so
remember when the Eternals came out and they bragged about how this was the first Marvel movie with a sex scene?
Was it the first one? I somehow
came out?
The Eternals.
The Eternals.
That's
I know, it's hard to remember.
It's not entirely true. Iron Man it doesn't show it, but it's the beginnings of one. There's sort of a scene in Iron Man. There's one in the Incredible Hulk, sort of. I can't remember beyond that, but
like, you get this mental list. You're like, See, you were talking about out of all the Western sort of things that you've seen, you're thinking there's only one Western produced thing that I've seen that doesn't have sexuality in it. And I thought you were going to say Bluey. Does that count as Western? It's Australian.
I haven't seen that.
You haven't seen Bluey?
No, I don't even know what that is.
That's super popular.
I would put this is on par with VeggieTales in terms of best anime ever. Bluey is fantastic. I cannot rant and rave enough about Bluey, because not only is it interesting, it's one of those shows that if my kids are watching this thing, my kids watch a lot of they don't watch a lot of dumb stuff.
But is Bluey made for children?
Yes, Bluey is made for children.
Said except children's media.
Yeah, but it's there's been a lot by adults. It's not just kind of dumb colors on the screen.
Like My Little Pony.
Because Puss in Boots, but that's degenerate now. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I thought was like, that's almost entirely free of morally problematic content. That some of the philosophy you can nitpick, but the Last Wish, for the most part, is like it's just a great example of a movie, and there's nothing morally problematic in it. But that's children's media. It's strange, in the past several years, some of the best media has been children's media, because adult media has either been degenerate or lazy.
Yeah, I used to watch a lot more movies and TV shows like back in the day than I do now. Like, most of my media consumption is on YouTube nowadays. And I think that is largely due to that. There's just, not only is there not anything interesting coming out lately, there's just so many things that has a clear political slant, and they're not interested in entertaining you and giving you a good story and giving you good characters. They want this to be something that influences you in a way that they see fit. You see that especially with TV shows and with Marvel, Star Wars, anything that's come out that used to be popular.
Actually, no, there is a couple of very, very minor offenses in The Last Wish. There's this one part where Puss in Boots says a very, very minor profanity, and later on there's this gag where the cute dog, it lets out like a string of profanity that's all censored, but like that's incredibly minor, compared to
Oh yeah, that was funny.
much more serious criticisms that you can put towards most media.
Oh yeah, in most media, you're going to have the worst offenses are going to be done without profanity. You're going to have the worst things being taught, said, and done without using cuss words even.
Yeah,
and I thought what was that Gibson film about the priest, Father Stew or something like?
Yeah.
It was a good movie, but he didn't need to have that much swearing in it. Why did he do that? He didn't need to have any swearing in it.
I get that he was trying to draw a contrast, I suppose, between Father Stew's former life and his new life.
Yeah,
as a
to make it realistic.
Yeah.
In the past,
which I get.
In the Bible it says Saint Peter, he cursed and he swore with an oath. That's all it says. We know what it means. It doesn't tell us what words he said. Like you don't need, especially the scene where when he's telling people that he doesn't know who Christ is, the way he's phrased, it implies that he said something inappropriate.
Or when when St. Paul said that, was comparing the old covenant to the new covenant, he says the old covenant was, the word that he used apparently was a very
it maybe I've never seen that actually backed up, because the way that swear words work is a word that's inappropriate in one decade might be a swear word 100 years later. So it
see, that's the thing about language, is that obviously if we were to tell them our swear words, if we went back in time, they'd be like, what are you talking about? That sounds funny.
Because our sensibilities have changed, whereas words that used to be considered incredibly vulgar, people have no problem with them now. But yeah, the point is that I don't know if you can necessarily demonstrate that Paul used a swear word, but if he did, it was like once in all of the scriptures.
Right.
But
definitely a time
what bothered me in particular is there's this scene in Father Stew where he's swearing in front of a child, and they have an actual child actor there. It's like, why do you need that? Why did you do that?
It makes me uncomfortable whenever child actors have to swear.
Well, the child didn't swear, but
but in general,
it's kind of shocking. You've seen this. I mean, I remember seeing this in the past, and on R-rated movies and stuff like that. Their shock value is one, either they'll have these people swearing and cussing up a storm in front of a child, or two, they'll have the child themselves swearing, and I suppose like the first 2-3 times it happened, it did have that intended shock value of, wow, I can't believe that a kid is saying this. But realistically, I mean, that's kind of akin to abuse. There is, I mean, obviously, I expect they got the parents' permission. Yeah, hey, can we get your kid to lay out all these expletives?
I don't like it, but I also it's relatively speaking, it's not that bad, because they already swear like that. That's just how people talk now, and it's not good. But on the relative list of offenses, it's a pretty minor one, unfortunately.
I remember watching the behind the scenes of Logan, the X-Men movie, which is a movie that I really like, actually. The child actor for Weapon X, she was called the Little Wolverine girl. She wasn't allowed to watch the movie after they made it, which I think was kind of funny. But another interesting thing was that Hugh Jackman, Wolverine's actor, he had to cuss quite a bit around her, and he cussed at her for the scene at one point. And then I remember her mom was on set, and he had to go and apologize and be like, "I'm sorry, miss. I'm sorry for cussing at your daughter." And yeah, it's just interesting when they have to have that dynamic, and they're basically like, "Yeah, you're gonna have an adult basically yell and cuss at you, and you gotta do this and this and this." There was a weird CinemaSins moment where actually Rev Perry pointed it out, where it was the Suicide Squad CinemaSins video, where I think one of the characters was like, "Oh, if there is a God, then he's not here, or there's so much suffering, the yada yada, why do bad things happen if God is real, etc." And then CinemaSin goes out and says, "Oh, actually, well, the absence of suffering is not a evidence that God is not here, and the idea that God would come back to end all suffering is not true." He said it was like a completely theological answer to it, and it was so weird. And I'm like,
yeah, well, that's That's because cinema sins are contrarian. So in another episode, they criticize the Genesis story for the dumbest possible reasons, and it's a very similar thing. Why did God let them sin at all? It's just them being contrarian, so they pull out whatever arguments they find on the internet, probably.
Yeah. There's at least another, I don't remember what other episode, but there was another episode of Cinema and Sins where they did a similar thing where somebody said some stupid kind of throwaway line about the devil, something about getting tricked by the devil, or the devil will understand, or I'll sell my soul, or something like that to the devil. And then the guy interrupts with like a 3-minute monologue about that's not how the devil works, and his whole thing is about tricking you and deceiving you, and he gets into actual theology about it, and then he cuts back to it, which is the joke. Obviously, that they're throwing in some kind of absurdist lines, but the absurdity there is wow, that's actually a kind of well thought out, well explained theological point. I think I doubt. I mean, I don't know that much about the Cinema Sins guys, but I doubt that they're super theologically astute. But I bet that they have somebody like on call where they're saying, "Hey, this guy said this religious thing. Can you give a critical response to it?" And I wish, just thinking back at all the movies and TV shows and stuff where there's a depiction of a Christian character or like Christian themes or whatever, I wish, Hollywood would do that. Like have a priest at least on call, just call up your local parish and be like,
Well,
hey, would a priest ever actually say this in a church, or is this like just the most blatant heresy?
Yeah, but depends on which priest they're contacting.
Yeah.
And it's always funny because every single Christian character that I see in like media, they say all the Christian things and they do some things that are Christian, but then it's like when they get a girlfriend, then they're like sleeping with each other on the third date. It's always funny.
That's not necessarily unrealistic.
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
but it's like it's so funny that they
that's
try
just
to
kind of-
depict these characters as sincerely as possible. Then it's like, oh, they're just like everyone else. Like Blue Bloods, for example, one of my favorite cop shows like ever. The family is Roman Catholic, like pretty Roman Catholic, and throughout the show,
8 out of 10.
they're like in relationships. They're sleeping with people who are not their spouses, who are not married, and so I'm just like, I don't know. It's very weird to me.
Do you remember The Simpsons back when The Simpsons was actually good? At a certain point, Ned Flanders. I mean, the whole joke about Ned Flanders is he's a Christian, but he's like a weird like evangelifish. He's kind of like an over the top depiction of Christianity, but he's supposed to be a sincere Christian. Like that's the whole thing about him. And at one point, they kill Maude, his wife. I think Homer ends up. She gets shot with like a t-shirt cannon or something, and dies. Which was one of the funny. Well, I don't know if it was a funny. I guess it was a funny twist in the show. It was one of the
That's hilarious.
shocking twists in the show. They just kill off this character, and it wasn't a joke. She's just dead, and they played it off as a joke. And Homer is never, whatever. Anyways, so they kill her off, and then there's an episode where I don't remember what season it is, but I remember they were talking about like Ned Flanders is trying to get back. Trying to get back on the market. He's trying to get past and try to find a new wife, and he wants to get a mother for his children and stuff. And it's actually like a really wholesome message, at that part at least. And it's depicting him in all these situations. He's just like the perfect guy. He's got chiseled abs and he's really nice to his kids, and he's really responsible, and he makes good money and all these other things. And he ends up meeting some female character that never shows up in any other episode after that. And go figure, first date, he goes on a picnic with her, and then he sleeps with her. And it's just kind of depicted as it's this ignorance, Hollywood ignorance of, well, yeah, obviously, even Christian, everybody just, that's what you do when you're dating somebody, you sleep with them. That's how it works.
In Ned Flanders' case, that's probably a defect. In Blue Bloods, though, in my experience, that's probably realistic, because a huge problem we have in the church is getting people to understand sexual morality and like actually care about it, because no one cares about it. And like one of the problems we have is people want to they want to join the church and they want their sacraments, but they don't want to get married to the people that they're living with and have children with, because they can't afford the fancy wedding they want.
Yeah. We have So
I'd get
this
married
is
in the forest with just a priest and me and my wife.
yeah, you sound like an Orthodox there, Eastern Orthodox. You, me and the bear and the priest and my wife and the
Me, the
birds.
bear, the priest with the
Some
Bible.
Disney. There's this has not happened at my parish, is why I talk about it. But this is something that I've encountered before. Is that that you've got couples, and there's a question of morality that they'll ask is you've got two 80-year-old people, a guy and a gal. They're both 80. Both of the each of them has had their spouse has died. There's no infidelity or anything like that. No divorce. It was just they're the widow and a widower, and they start living together. But each of them is kind of living off of the pension of their deceased spouse. And if they get married, then because of the legal system they lose the pension. So the question that they have is it moral to continue to live together unmarried to avoid the legal consequences? And they just kind of assume, well, yeah, it is. And part of the difficult part of being a pastor and struggling with this is saying, no, just because you're 80, just because you've got a reason, I guess, to not get married doesn't exempt you from God's prescription for married couples.
For us, that answer would be a bit more nuanced because we have ecclesiastical marriage distinct from civil marriage. And there are circumstances where where your civil marriage status does not have to correspond to your ecclesiastical marriage status because of legal technicalities. I'm not sure in this particular circumstance, but for us it's different because we have our own laws. So,
well, yeah, like not every country is going to have marriage be a part of governance that is a title that is given by the state or the governing authority. Sometimes it is literally just a institution in the church that is given by the priest or the pastor or whoever has authority there that bestows it onto the couple. So I definitely see that, and honestly I actually prefer that.
It's even in the catechism that you can get civilly divorced if it's necessary for certain legal rights. Because to us, well, either it wasn't a marriage at all and you're just divorcing to show it isn't a marriage, or you are still married, but you're separated, and for legal reasons you need to file for divorce. And it's because sometimes there's that tension between what the state says and what we believe is actually the case, and we have to negotiate. It's not always clear how it's supposed to relate because the state's concept of marriage and justice is not the same as ours.
I think that's going to be increasingly a problem in the future when you have the state defining marriage in all these different ways, where they're defining or redefining marriage, and they're saying, well, marriage is this, marriage is this, marriage is this, and marriage is also this. At a certain point, Christians might have to start asking the question. They say, when I'm getting married, I'm using the Bible's definition of marriage. Do I really need to sign up also to the state's definition of marriage? Because the state's definition of marriage is so broad, it includes all of these things that the Bible explicitly forbids. Like at a certain point, when the state defines marriage so sinfully, so incorrectly, there could be a point where Christians say, you know what? We have marriage and you have your thing, and we're not going to participate in your thing. We're going to keep getting married like we have since since Adam and Eve.
I certainly think if your argument is that the state that they're using the word marriage entirely equivocally, and Christians can have church marriages, and they are married, but they're not married in the eyes of the state. I think at that point that's not grave matter. That's just an interpretation of what your obligations are when you're married. Again, especially for us, the Catholic Church, because we consider our marriages to be above civil law. Like civil law recognizes or doesn't recognize, it might interact with our marriages. But if you're married in the church or a member of the church, you're sort of exempted from civil law in our eyes. So it's not necessarily grave matter if you just argue that that you don't want to even bother with the civil thing because they're using it equivocally. But that is
I've heard the Ben Shapiro explanation of, well, we should get the government out of marriage entirely. And
No.
I kind of
He doesn't say that. He said that for a while, but he doesn't say that now. He says that
did he
government
change his
has a
mind?
vested interest in the procreation of children, so government should be
Okay, there
involved in
you
marriage
go.
only in so long
Yes.
as it's promoting a lifelong heterosexual union.
Right. Because
But
thing is,
that's the
if
big
they're
dichotomy.
not,
It's like, would you want the state who is not in, under the moral authority of Christianity, or who is filled with a bunch of people who are not interested in Christian morality or Christian ethics, or bestowing that onto the state? Like, do you allow these people to define marriage for you, or do you completely separate the concept entirely and say, well, you have your civil unions and we have marriage, running the risk of letting marriage be further dispersed and
it's
eventually uh, disappear from the culture?
I think as the laws stand now, my my tendency is, if it were a choice, leave things as they are now or get rid of state marriage entirely. I would have to get rid of state marriage entirely if it were in my power, because right now the laws require civil servants to grant homosexual marriages, which is immoral. And by repealing the law, you would be repealing that. Whereas by keeping the law, the state is actively compelling people to commit sin.
I think it's
And now, obviously,
similar to the kind of, should the state be involved in education? Well, in the past, you can say, well, the state is competent enough to teach education, but at this point, especially religious education, because all education is ultimately religious. At a certain aspect, if you're teaching about history, morality, anything like that, eventually, even science, you're gonna come back to some religious aspect. And while in the past you could say, look, the state is competent enough to teach, these subjects. But at this point, it's gotten to the point where people say, we want to put prayer back in schools. It's like, no, we want to take schools out of the hand of government. Say, well, I want the government needs to teach my children about God. I'm like, no, you don't want that, because the government has no idea who God is.
That's actually my response to the rad trads who are upset over Dignitatis Humanae, and they're like, how dare you say freedom of religion? It's like, okay, so what you're saying is that you want the state involved in religion. Like, you want the United States of America involved in religion.
You trust the politicians to teach your children about religion.
And obviously they don't. That's not what they want. They want them to become Catholic. But the point is, the way that a lot of us read Dignitatis Humanae is just as an acceptance of fact, which is that the Catholic Church has no political power. We are run by people who do not care what we say. And in that circumstance, they obviously have no authority over religious matters. And it's better for us if everyone has freedom of religion, because we're not in a privileged position anymore. It's just not realistic.
Well,
it's also the culture of America itself. I think the culture of America, it lends itself to just being extremely reactionary. Like, we as an American culture, we simply just hate being told what to do. Whenever the status quo changes, now it's like, okay, now we just hate you now because you're in power, you're telling us what to do, and we don't want to do that. You're using the state. Radical individual libertarianism that's infected so many corners of American political thought. And it's just like, well, we all just want to grill in our backyards and we don't want to have a thought in the world about anything. And it's like, that's not how society works. That's not how a community works. There needs to be a awareness of the people around you, and there needs to be involvement in the community around you, and that requires a sense of morality to be.
But our current government is in no position to do that.
Absolutely not. That we can agree on.
Romans 13 is an interesting passage, because it talks about, because the government would not promote evil or whatever. It's the government, the wielder of the sword wields it for good, and doesn't punish evil, or I mean, obviously,
they punish the evil. Yeah, that is a weird chapter, and it's a chapter I point to against anyone who is even slightly of an anarchist tendency. Is that he called the Antichrist a servant of God and said to obey him because he punishes evil people.
Right.
That the Roman emperors were the Antichrist in the early Christian thought. Like,
oh yeah, Nero.
And the apostles still say, honor them because they're God's servants for your good.
Right. Was it First or Second Peter? Like the Epistle of Peter were written during Nero's reign when
he was imprisoned.
literally.
When he says the Church of Babylon greets you or whatever, he's saying he is imprisoned by Nero, awaiting execution by crucifixion, and he's telling people to honor the king.
Well, Jesus honors both Herod and Pilate, but
well, not Herod really. He Herod is the person that Christ is actually the harshest towards, because he only rebukes Herod. He rebukes the Pharisees several times,
right,
which is kind of an act of love. He rebukes Herod once, and that's only. He's not even talking to Herod. He's talking to the Sadducees, I think. And when he's in Herod's presence, he just stays silent. He doesn't say anything. He had a remarkably low view of Herod, which is interesting.
I don't know, I'd have to look at the chapter again. Again, this is one of those situations where you have God standing in front of a ruler who thinks that he's hot snot, and he has every right to tell Herod to shut up, and then Herod falls down like a dead man or something like that. Like that could very well have happened. And Jesus instead chooses to stay silent in front of him, and yeah, similar. Well, Pilate, it's more clear, kind of Jesus's interaction where he says, you would have no authority if it wasn't given to you, but by doing, he's acknowledging that Pilate has been given authority by God. This person who Pilate, he tries to wash his hands. He's a murderer. This murderer has been given authority by God. Even Herod was given authority by God. It's
yeah, obviously, but I just mean,
but yeah,
right. I just mean it is interesting. Herod is the person that Christ is like abuses the most. Like Herod is somehow the epitome of wickedness to the point that it's not even worth talking to or about him. He's just evil.
Well, it's interesting because this is why the deity and the messianic authority of Christ was questioned so much, even by his own disciples, because in the Jewish tradition, they viewed the Messiah as someone who would come in like a flaming chariot, who would release the captives, the Jewish captives of their Roman oppressors, who would come and establish a new Israel and completely squash all the enemies of Israel and establish his kingdom on earth. When Jesus comes around, he's like, you barely see him get tangled up in the politics of the Romans. If anything, he had more to say to the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership, who were being hypocrites, than he did with the Roman oppression and mistreatment of his people. So to them, it's just like, well, what are you doing, Jesus? Like, why aren't you actually doing something about the political oppression and the mistreatment of your own people, which you say you love dearly?
Well, it's a contrast, I think, between Saul of the Old Testament and David. Saul of the Old Testament, if you look at the description of him, he's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's this figure, this war horse riding, flowing mane figure of this is what they wanted as a king, although that's ultimately not what was best for them. David was what was best for them in contrast to Saul. And Jesus, I think, is similar. They wanted a war horse riding, king head and shoulders above everybody else to come in and stomp out the Roman Empire. But that's not what Jesus, ultimately. Well, that's not what he did. That's not what his goal was. Now, Revelation time period. Oh, that's different.
That's when he comes around.
But the thing is, he did defeat. The thing is, he did defeat the Romans. He just did it in a better way, which was, he says, do not fear the ones who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Fear the one who can kill both body and soul in Gehenna. He's saying he's freeing men from the fear of the Romans. Like the Romans are no longer a threat to Christians, because if they kill us, it doesn't matter. We just get crowned in heaven. Like he's freed us from the necessity of caring about the Romans.
Right. Everything for the Old Testament was extremely carnal, extremely physical. But Jesus came and called us to a higher cause. He called us to the spiritual, to the metaphysical. He said, do not store up treasures on earth, store up treasures in heaven. You see this language all throughout the New Testament and how he talks about things on earth, which is like, you're going to go through suffering, you're going to go through things that are harsh, that are going to suck. But ultimately, you're not looking for anything material. You're not looking for a new king to come down and create a new earthly kingdom of Israel. You're going to be looking for something much higher. You're going to be looking for something much bigger than any of that, because all of that is corrupted. All that which is carnal has been corrupted and needs to be made new.
Yeah, the kingdom of God does not come with signs, because the kingdom of God is within you.
Abide in me and I will abide in you.
Yeah, the danger, of course, being to fall into the Gnosticism of saying, well, that means, well, yeah, everything on everything physical falls away. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything physical is evil, a shell to be discarded.
Right. That's like what is it? There was the Gnostics who say like everything material is evil.
It's always the Gnostics and their demiurge and all this.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in theology class.
I will never stop enjoying that the Gnosticism is a Jewish thing. It comes from Jewish. So actually, there's claims that it was the Samaritans. I'm not sure to what degree that's true, but it was a Jewish heresy that was picked up by Christians.
Yeah, go figure.
And there's still Gnostic tendencies in Kabbalah. If you read what is taught in Kabbalah, there's a lot of Gnostic tendency in it. Not that the material world is evil, but in other ways.
Yeah, it's corrupted, but it's still, used for God's purpose.
This is, yeah, I mean, I suppose the resurrection of the body is one of these things where that's one of the big contrasts that I see in the modern day, that a lot of people think, that the body is a shell. I can't, how many movies and TV shows have kind of talked about language like that, as the body is just a shell holding me back. Now I'm going to be free, now that I'm free from this body, but it's going to be discarded. But the idea is that the body is raised again and perfected in some miraculous way.
You do see saints using that language, but they're talking in a context where everyone knows what they mean.
Right.
That they're talking about what Paul calls the earthly tent. They're talking about the body of death and corruption, but it's understood that it will one day put on immortality. And it does, like, there's this song that I want to like it, but then there's this, it has this deficiency of not mentioning the resurrection, because it talks a lot about the angel setting your spirit free, the bars of clay bursting open, but it doesn't mention the resurrection. And that's a deficiency. And I know that the people who wrote it know about the resurrection and believed in it and looked forward to it, but they emphasize so much the freedom from the body that they don't mention the salvation of the body.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to kind of resolve that is to point to the resurrection of Christ, is that he was resurrected in the same body that was crucified. It wasn't that the body remained in the tomb, but that he's resurrected in the body. I mean, he retains the spear wound and the nail holes. This is one indicator. I mean, the absence of a body in the tomb is another indicator, but this is one of the indicators that the body does remain. It's perfected in some form.
Jehovah's Witnesses' excuse for that is that he just manifested the wounds. They weren't really in his body.
Jeez,
he
just there for
when he says a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. Well, he assumed flesh and bones temporarily to appear to the apostles, but really it's a spirit body.
Yeah, it's spirit body, and he's later on grilling fish over coals or whatever, and he's like eating and
on his own
I'm hungry.
planet.
Do you have any food for my spirit body?
Yeah, again, all of that they would say was just a carnal. He temporarily assumed carnal form to appear to the apostles, but that wasn't his ultimate form. That's there somewhere in the Bible.
The mental gymnastics required to be like, you know what, Jesus didn't actually mean what he said. It was all a ruse. It was all a trick. He only pretended to be hungry and pretended to have a physical body and pretended that he had these wounds and manifested these things. Just, good grief, you guys.
That's one of the reasons why I've had such a hard time finding like what denomination I fit into, because I see it with every single faith tradition and denomination, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, is that there are things that are extremely straightforward that they can point to, and it's like the scripture says this, the tradition says this, the council says this, and it's very straightforward. And then there's other passages where they're like, Well, the context and the reading between the lines, and if you look at how they were talking, if you look at the person who wrote this and what languages they were familiar with and who they were talking to, and it's just like, I don't know. It's always interesting to me.
I that's what I hear about the so there's the passages.
Reformers are the biggest nerds on that.
Yeah, yeah. Read not Melanchthon. Read Chemnitz on that. Chemnitz is the biggest dweeb. I can't wait to meet him in heaven. He's got to be the biggest brainiac. Luther is all about fart jokes, and Melanchthon is more conciliatory, and then Chemnitz is just he's brutally autistic. Just encyclopedia knowledge, but not trying to offend people like Luther, not trying to reconcile with people like Chemnitz or like Melanchthon, but there's the passages I think about are, Paul's talking about women should stay silent in the church, and I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man, and he's talking about the order of worship, and obviously this extends to the office of the priest / pastor / elder / episcopos / presbyteros / whatever you want to call it. It extends to that office as well. And the people reading these things will say, well, this is Paul. Actually, the women were just making a racket.
This is Paul saying I can beat my wife.
This is Paul saying, that's Ephesians 5 says I could beat my wife. No, this is Paul saying that there were these congregations where the women just happened to be making a racket. And he said to, hold the racket until you get home and make a racket at home. And it's just so much is read into the text to kind of deny the meaning. So yeah, for example, the text I think is talking about I do not permit a woman to have authority, whatever. It talks about Timothy, Paul uses the reference of since Adam and Eve. Like he doesn't say because this church, the Corinthian women happen to be particularly noisy, therefore I want them to shut up in church. No, he says, this goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, and Adam was created first, and kind of Adam is it's the idea that Adam is the spiritual leader of the household, and it was his job to teach and to preach in the household. Yeah,
I find it simultaneously amusing and kind of frustrating that in the modern commentaries you have say the complementary and conservative approach of the scriptures. It always has to be, but we're not saying this. And then you read actual historical commentaries on the passage, and there is none of that. It's all just woman taught once and man fell. The women are morally, physically, and they're inferior in both soul and body to man. They quote the Ecclesiastes: "One man out of 1,000 I have found, but one woman I have not found."
There's some savage church fathers on that, like savage.
And because it wasn't until recently that we started. Like you see, of course, people addressing some of the arguments about women being of the same nature, and what about this? And like they're not misogynistic, but you don't have the same but we have to make sure that we're saying that they are this. Like they just outright say that women are inferior in both soul and body, and therefore are subjected to man as a punishment for Eve's disobedience.
That sounds like Origen. I seem to remember a quote from Origen in particular. He says something.
But it's all of them.
I remember reading another ones too. But I think Origen's got one of the most blatant statements on something like that. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I remember reading it. I'm like, man, this dude. I can understand the surgery he went under if this is how well he got along with women. But yeah, well, allegedly self-surgery.
But the thing is, we get offended by that now, but I think that they're right. You just have to interpret it correctly, which is that what they mean by, well, obviously they're bodily inferior. You can't dispute that they are physically inferior. But the other thing is that
they are more susceptible to emotion.
Right. Yeah, and that also is not disputable. That women psychologically tend to have a deontological, compassionate sort of morality, whereas men have a more utilitarian, justice-based morality, and one of those is more conducive to leadership and caring for the common good. You have to have both, but that's the thing is when people hear the saints talking about the deficiencies of something and how one thing is better, they think that they're saying that means like, oh well, women are inferior and they're defective and that means that it's bad. But they're not saying
And
that. They're
go
saying
their own
God
way.
created both. God created both for certain roles. But anytime you have this distinction in role, one of them is bad. It's like they would say that the stars have more glorious bodies than we do, but we have better forms than they do. That our souls are superior to the forms of the stars, but our bodies are inferior to the bodies of the stars. And they're very frank about the deficiencies of the human body and how man is prevented by his bulk from. It's interesting to me how the way people talk, how frank they were about reality, like saying man is prevented by his bulk from flying or whatever, and that the nature of the body is to deteriorate and so forth, and just like they would acknowledge, yeah, of course it is. In itself, women are superior in the ability to feed children, in the ability to give birth. But if you take it all together as a whole, man is the more perfect sex. But that doesn't mean that women are bad. It means that they have a different perfection that is inferior.
Yeah, I think our automatic assumption in our society is to see everything as a value judgment. If you say that if you want to compare it to tools, men are a multi-tool. Men are something that fit a lot of different situations kind of generally well. But there's some very specific, unique things that men absolutely cannot do, or if they can do them, don't do them well. I don't know. We see specialization as a value judgment. You say, well, this person is
Women
great.
are generally better with people.
Yeah. So yeah,
which is why they're so good at like jobs like such as serving at restaurants, community service. What's the other one? Customer service. Anything that deals with people primarily, while the guys go for things like engineering.
I don't know. I can't say I like waitresses, but that's because I'm antisocial.
No, I mean, you were talking about before.
I knew you were afraid of women.
Due to the it's Sola Ecclesia, more like Sola always alone. Sola yourself. No, yeah, I mean, yeah. There's in terms of kind of leadership styles and stuff. There's a degree where you have to be cold, calculating, and almost mechanical, rational to be a good leader in some respects. But you also need advisors. You need people who can communicate. You need the velvet glove to go over the iron fist. There's you can be a hammer in search of a nail, but and that can solve a lot of situations. But there are limitations to that where you need a specialist. You need to call somebody in who's good at something that you are not capable of dealing with.
The feminine role is usually more subtle and hidden. It's like Jonathan Pajot uses the example of a king is in his I forget what they call the cabinet, but the king in council. And he has this idea and he's made up his mind. And then the next day, mysteriously, after everyone's gone to bed, he changed his mind and no one knows why.
Well,
I use that example of like women as wives and mothers having this influence, but it's going to be a more hidden, less direct influence. It's not that they get to make the decisions as much as they get to offer the perspective and remind the men of the practicalities that they weren't thinking about, like
Pilot's wife.
I actually use this as an example, as an analogy in a conversation that I had. I think it was just yesterday, where you have the king, who's the husband, and he's the one who has the final say. He makes the decision. He's the leader. And then you have his counselor, the one who's usually his most trusted advisor, the one who is by his side, who is trusted with many, functions of the state that he decides to leave to her or him. And she can bring her advice, which a lot of times can be more rational, can be more grounded in things that the man didn't think about, or even give an emotional perspective that, like you said, to the more cold and calculating sort of personality, she could come to him and be like, well, that's not how you should go about this. There's this thing there. He could feel that way. She could feel that way, which is why I think, he describes the woman in the scriptures as the crown on which, at which sits on the head of the man, because you can be the leader of a state or the leader of the household and still be able to, you know, take advice, take some information from others, and let that influence your decision making.
Yeah, I remember hearing that men and women on average, a way that our brains are different is that men compartmentalize things. You know, if we're focused on one thing, fishing or something, we're focused on that thing, and we're not thinking about. If you ask us a question about something else, blank. Women are different. You know, they think about everything as a web, like it's all connected, it's all together. They're thinking of everything sort of at once. So women have the limitation. That means if something is wrong in their lives, it interrupts their ability they can't compartmentalize it because it's all connected, so that something has gone wrong, they can't focus on the other things because they're overwhelmed by that thing. Men can compartmentalize.
That
But of course, the flip side of that is that men can get tunnel vision, and we can be so focused on this thing and how we're going to make it great that we forget how it's going to affect something else. And so that's where, you know, for instance, a man might have some kind of business idea and he's going to go for it and he's going to accomplish this thing. And then his wife reminds him that he has a family and he can't actually do that because it's impractical.
That was a funny thing that Michael Knowles actually talked about, who is now becoming one of my favorite commentators on the Daily Wire, where he was talking with I think it was Brett Cooper, where he said, you know, we often think of women as having the less grounded, the more emotional, the more out there sort of mindset, when in reality it's usually the men that have that mindset of, we're going to go conquer the world, we're going to go create a business, we're going to go, you know, write these epic tales, we're going to go slay the dragon, etc., etc. And then the women are like, you have a house to keep afloat, you've got a kitchen to clean, you've got some kids to take to school, etc., etc. And so, yeah, I think that's something that we tend to not forget, but we tend to sort of, what's the word, undervalue.
Well, again, I think it's also because in our modern culture, well, for one thing, we've actually fetishized the masculine. So we don't want women to be feminine. We want them to be masculine because masculinity is better, which is, you know, that's not actual. You'd think that something called feminism would care more about genuine femininity, but
it's a man's world.
But also, I think if you focus too much on the feminine and their strengths, you do get feminism, which is this. Well, hold on. If women are more level-headed and women are more able to, you know, they're less angry, they're less tunnel-visioned, they're more compassionate. Shouldn't women be in charge? You focus so much on the feminine strength that you get tunnel vision the other way. You start to elevate that, and that's why I think historically they just sort of dismissed women in most contexts, because like everyone knew that you have wives and mothers and sisters that you go to and that they're important, but there was something about society being stronger when you kind of didn't acknowledge
the white collar jobs and the CEO.
Like it's there in the chivalric tales. You have, you know, the knight's mother who sends him off and the damsel who gives him advice and aid, but it's the man who actually accomplishes things, and it's the man who gets all the glory. But you know, it's the Proverbs of Lemuel that he was taught by his mother. You know, there's that mention, but the credit goes to the man, but he got it from the woman. And there's something about
a lot of great heroes
that works that way.
There's a lot of great heroes of old literature where, you know, they actually had really good relationships with their mothers.
There's an interesting aspect of kind of, I mean, you think about Hollywood has downplayed as the damsel in distress trope, but there's an aspect of some very good stories out there where the motivating factor is the woman. The man is able to accomplish great feats and heroic events because he's motivated by either, you know, by his wife, by a woman that he loves. And there's a reason that this is such an effective, you know, we just take it for granted that, you know, this guy's going to go conquer Troy for Helen, you know, that they're going to go on this quest to save the damsel in the castle. And we're just like, yeah, I'd do that.
One of the things I love about the Passion of the Christ is that there are these times where Christ is like, he seems to be physically overpowered. He's completely down and weak, and he can't move anymore. But then his mother and his disciples show up, and he sees his mother and disciples, and it gives him this second strength, and he's able to stand up and keep bearing the pain. It's like this reminder. That's like that he wasn't just letting himself be killed for no reason. Like, he was doing it for them. He was doing it for that. He was saving us, and it's this way of showing that he was able to endure that because it was love for us. Like that's the story, is the man laying himself down for his bride.
Yeah, there was a common trope in Hollywood for like a long time where it would be about a son losing his father, and he'd go and, become a man himself. And then there's this recent trope that I've been noticing a lot more where, there's this mother who is sort of abusive or is not there for their son, who is estranged from their children. I don't know. It's something that I've noticed a lot more in recent Hollywood movies. Whether it's something like what was the movie that recently came out where that happened? It was like a Moon Knight. Moon Knight was one that was a show that came out where it's like this kid was basically abused by his mother after his dad died, and that's the reason he became so sheltered and so like pitiful.
Tangled is about an abusive mother, and one of the reasons that people don't like Tangled is because, I don't know, apparently a lot of Americans come from like incredibly dysfunctional households, and so it was.
I love Tangled.
Whereas I, have never experienced that, so to me, Tangled was like entertaining, and I find that dynamic entertaining, in context of the film.
Yeah,
for a lot of people, they couldn't because it was too relatable, and it was too real, and it just made them uncomfortable.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. This was actually part 2 of a 3-part episode. That's right, I sat down for 3 hours to discuss with these guys all the topics that came up, and because I'm not Joe Rogan, I didn't think that releasing a 3-hour episode would get much playthrough. In any case, the 3rd part of the episode, coming out next week, begins the discussion on feminism, femininity, masculinity, and what the Bible has to say about all of these things. What does it mean to be biblically masculine? What examples do we have from the Bible? So if you're looking forward to some of that and some of Sola's hot takes on feminism, then stay tuned next week, and we'll kick right off and get right into it with that discussion. Take care and God bless.